Hey guys, tonight we're descending into the literal underground of Victorian London, into the sewers and tunnels that ran beneath one of the world's largest cities. We're talking about what really lurked in those dark passages at night, and I can promise you the reality was far stranger and more disturbing than most people imagine. This isn't just about rats and waste, though there was plenty of both. This is about the people who lived down there, the things that grew in the darkness, the dangers that workers faced, and the secrets that the tunnels held. So, before we go any further into this subterranean journey, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, especially those of you settling in for the night. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's exploration of what lurked beneath Victorian London streets. The Victorian sewer system of London was an engineering marvel, a vast network of tunnels and pipes that stretched for thousands of miles beneath the city. But before we talk about what lived and lurked in these tunnels, we need to understand what they were and why they existed. For most of London's history, the city had no proper sewage system. Human waste was collected in cesspits beneath houses, and when these filled up, they were emptied by night soil men who would cart the waste away to be sold as fertilizer. But as London's population exploded during the 19th century, growing from about 1 million to over 6 million people, this system became completely inadequate. Cesspits overflowed. Streets ran with sewage. And most horrifically, all of this waste eventually made its way into the Thames, the same river from which many Londoners drew their drinking water. The result was disease on a catastrophic scale. Cholera epidemics swept through London repeatedly throughout the 1830s and 1840s, killing tens of thousands. The miasma theory, the belief that disease was caused by bad air rather than contaminated water, was widely accepted. But even under that misunderstanding, it was clear that something had to be done about the overwhelming stench and filth. The Great Stink of 1858, when a hot summer caused the Thames to become so foul that Parliament couldn't function due to the smell, finally forced action. Joseph Bazalgette, the chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works, was commissioned to design and build a comprehensive sewer system for London. And the result was an underground city of tunnels that would transform public health. Bazalgette's sewers, constructed between 1859 and 1875, consisted of a main network of underground brick-lined tunnels that intercepted the old sewers and cesspits and redirected sewage away from central London to outfall points downstream. The tunnels varied in size from small pipes just inches in diameter to massive tunnels large enough to drive a carriage through. The largest intercepting sewers were true underground galleries, vaulted brick chambers that could be 8 feet tall or more, with channels of sewage running along the bottom and walkways on either side for maintenance access. These tunnels stretched for miles in perpetual darkness, the only light coming from the occasional inspection shaft or from the lanterns carried by the workers who ventured down into them. Now, what lurked in these tunnels? Let's start with the obvious: rats. The rat population of Victorian London was enormous, with estimates suggesting there were more rats than people. Perhaps 6 or 7 million rats to match the 6 million human residents. The sewers provided perfect habitat for rats, dark, damp, with an endless supply of food from both sewage and from the organic waste that flowed into the system. The rats that lived in the sewers were different from those that lived in streets and houses. They were larger, bolder, and had adapted specifically to the underground environment. Some reports from sewer workers described rats the size of small cats, though this was probably exaggeration mixed with the distorting effects of lantern light and fear. But even normal-sized rats were dangerous in large numbers, and sewer workers regularly encountered swarms of dozens or hundreds of rats that would scatter before them, or occasionally stand their ground and attack if cornered. The rats weren't just a nuisance or a frightening sight, they were a genuine hazard. Rat bites could cause serious infection in the filthy environment of the sewers. Rats could knock over lanterns, plunging workers into complete darkness in tunnels where getting lost could be fatal. And rats were vectors for disease, particularly leptospirosis, also known as Weil's disease, which is transmitted through rat urine and was common among sewer workers. The disease causes flu-like symptoms that can progress to kidney and liver failure, and it was often fatal before modern antibiotics. Sewer workers accepted rat encounters as routine, but the fear of rats was ever present, and stories circulated of workers being overwhelmed by rat swarms, though documentation of such incidents is sparse and may be more legend than reality. But rats were far from the only inhabitants of the sewers. Pigs lived down there, truly. In the poorest areas of Victorian London, particularly in the East End, it wasn't uncommon for pigs to fall through gaps in the streets or to be deliberately released into the sewers, where they would survive by eating the organic matter in the sewage. These sewer pigs became semi-feral, living their entire lives underground, growing to substantial size on the rich diet available in the tunnels. Occasionally, when pigs were spotted during maintenance work, efforts would be made to catch them, as they represented valuable meat. But catching a pig in a dark, slippery sewer tunnel was dangerous work, and many sewer pigs lived out their lives underground, their descendants creating populations that persisted for years. Reports from the late 19th century mention encounters with feral pigs in the sewers, and it's possible that some pig populations persisted into the early 20th century. Then there were the dogs. Abandoned or lost dogs sometimes found their way into the sewers through street grates or access points, and some survived by eating rats and sewage. These dogs became feral, losing their domestication and reverting to more wild behaviors. Packs of dogs living in the sewers were occasionally reported, though they were more rare than rats or pigs. The dogs would avoid humans when possible, but cornered dogs or protective mothers with puppies could be aggressive. The howling and barking of dogs echoing through sewer tunnels was reported by multiple workers and was considered one of the more unsettling sounds of the underground. The familiar sound of a dog made eerie and threatening by the acoustics of the tunnels, and the knowledge that these were not friendly pets, but feral animals fighting for survival. The flora of the sewers deserves attention as well, because contrary to what you might expect, things grew down there. Fungi thrived in the damp, dark environment, growing on the brick walls, on organic matter that accumulated in the tunnels, and sometimes on the clothing or equipment of workers who spent extended time underground. Some of these fungi were harmless, but others were toxic or hallucinogenic. Sewer workers reported episodes of disorientation, confusion, or visual distortions that might have been caused by breathing in fungal spores, though they attributed these symptoms to sewer gas. The fungi created bizarre landscapes in parts of the sewer. Some tunnels were described as having walls covered with pale, ghostly growths, giving them an otherworldly appearance in the dim light of work lanterns. Bacteria formed thick biofilms on the walls and in the channels where sewage flowed, creating slippery surfaces and producing the characteristic smell of sewers. Some bacteria were bioluminescent, producing faint glows in the absolute darkness of the tunnels. This foxfire, or will-o'-the-wisp effect, was occasionally reported by sewer workers. Eerie glowing patches on walls, or floating lights that seemed to move through the tunnels. These lights had perfectly natural biological explanations, but in an era when belief in ghosts and supernatural phenomena was common, and in an environment as unsettling as the sewers, these glowing bacteria probably fed into the folklore and fear that surrounded the underground system. The people who worked in the sewers, the flushers and sewer hunters, were a distinct class of Victorian worker who lived on the margins of society. Flushers were official employees, hired by the Metropolitan Board of Works to maintain the system, clearing blockages, inspecting for damage, and ensuring the sewage continued to flow. They worked in gangs of 3 to 6 men, entering the sewers through manholes and spending hours or entire shifts underground. The work was dangerous, exhausting, and psychologically taxing. The smell was overwhelming, a thick, toxic miasma of human waste, rotting organic matter, and chemical effluent from factories that dumped into the system. Workers could become desensitized to the smell over time, but many reported that they could never fully escape it, that it clung to their skin and clothes, that they could taste it for hours after leaving the tunnels. The dangers of sewer work went far beyond rats and smell. Toxic gases were the most serious threat. Sewer gas, primarily methane and hydrogen sulfide, could accumulate in pockets in the tunnels, particularly in dead-end sections or where ventilation was poor. Methane was explosive, and lanterns or candles carried by workers could ignite pockets of gas, causing explosions that killed workers instantly or left them burned and trapped in collapsing tunnels. Hydrogen sulfide, which smells like rotten eggs, was toxic in high concentrations and could cause unconsciousness and death within minutes. Workers learned to watch their candle flames. If the flame turned blue or went out, it meant bad air, and they needed to retreat immediately. But this warning system wasn't always reliable, and men died regularly from gas exposure or explosions in the sewers. Drowning was another constant risk. The sewers normally carried a few feet of sewage, enough to make walking difficult, but not immediately dangerous. But heavy rainfall could cause the sewers to flood rapidly, with the water level rising from ankle deep to over a man's head in a matter of minutes. Workers caught in the wrong section of tunnel during a sudden flood had to race for the nearest exit shaft, climbing ladders while water rose behind them. Some didn't make it, trapped in dead-end sections, or simply unable to reach an exit in time. They drowned in the rising sewage. The bodies of drowned sewer workers were sometimes not recovered for days or weeks. When the water level dropped enough for search parties to enter and locate them, if they could be found at all in the miles of dark tunnels. Structural collapses were also common. The sewers were built to high standards, but they were constantly subjected to pressure from the weight of buildings and traffic above, to chemical corrosion from the sewage, and to physical wear from the flow of water and debris. Sections of tunnel would occasionally collapse without warning, burying workers in tons of brick and earth. Even minor collapses could be fatal if they blocked the only exit from a section of tunnel, trapping workers with limited air supply. Rescue operations in the sewers were extremely difficult, requiring rescuers to enter dangerous, potentially unstable tunnels while dealing with flooding, gas, and darkness. Many trapped workers simply couldn't be reached in time and died waiting for rescue that couldn't arrive. The unofficial inhabitants of the sewers, the sewer hunters or toshers, were even more fascinating and disturbing than the official workers. Toshers were scavengers who entered the sewers illegally to search for valuables. The sewers carried an enormous amount of material beyond just waste: coins, jewelry, silverware, tools, anything that might fall through street grates or be flushed from houses. Valuable items accumulated in the sewer sludge, and toshers would wade through sewage, often in darkness or with minimal light to avoid detection, sifting through the muck looking for anything they could sell. It was horrifically unpleasant and dangerous work, but for the desperately poor, it was also potentially lucrative. A successful tosher might find enough coins and valuables in a night to feed their family for a week. Toshers developed elaborate knowledge of the sewer system, learning routes and locations where valuables tended to accumulate. They worked at night when official workers were least likely to be present, entering through hidden access points or through connections to the older, unmapped parts of the system. They dressed in distinctive clothing, long coats with large pockets for carrying fines, heavy boots, and often a canvas apron. They carried lanterns that could be shuttered to hide their presence, and sticks or poles for probing the sewage and fending off rats. Toshers worked alone or in small groups, and they were intensely secretive about their routes and techniques, passing knowledge down through families or tight-knit groups, but rarely sharing with outsiders. The toshers were not just scavengers, but also became folklore figures, semi-legendary characters in the Victorian imagination. Stories circulated about tosher kings who controlled access to certain areas of the sewers, about fabulous treasures found in the muck, about toshers who disappeared and were never seen again, presumably killed by rats or gas or collapses or something worse. Some of these stories had basis in fact. Toshers did occasionally find significant treasures, and they did sometimes disappear. But the stories took on mythological dimensions, with the sewers becoming a sort of underworld with its own rules, its own dangers, and its own rewards for those brave or desperate enough to enter. The older sections of London's sewer system, those that predated Bazalgette's grand scheme, were even more dangerous and mysterious. These were often medieval or earlier in origin, narrow, crumbling tunnels that had been incorporated into the newer system, or that connected to it through unofficial access points. These old sewers were unmapped in many cases, their routes forgotten or never properly documented. They could contain all sorts of unexpected features: sudden drops, flooded sections, spaces where the tunnel narrowed to almost nothing. Toshers who ventured into these old sewers risked getting lost in a maze where one tunnel looked like every other, where taking a wrong turn could lead to a dead end with no way back, where the only landmarks were gradually obscured by rising water or extinguished light. The homeless and destitute sometimes took shelter in the sewers, particularly in winter when temperatures above ground could be lethal, and the relatively constant temperature underground, while hardly comfortable, at least prevented freezing. Rough chambers near access points, spaces where tunnels widened, or where alcoves provided shelter from the main flow of sewage. These became temporary homes for people with nowhere else to go. They would enter at night, sleep fitfully in the darkness and stench, and leave before official workers arrived in the morning. Some of the most desperate stayed longer, spending days or weeks underground, emerging only occasionally to search for food or to sell items they had scavenged from the tunnels. These sewer dwellers existed in a state of almost unimaginable misery, breathing toxic air, surrounded by filth and rats, cut off from sunlight and normal human contact, but still choosing this over the alternatives available to them on the streets above. The diseases that thrived in the sewers and that afflicted those who worked in them deserve careful examination, because they tell us about the real biological horrors that lurked in those tunnels. Cholera, the disease that had driven the creation of the sewer system in the first place, was caused by bacteria in contaminated water. And while the new sewers eventually helped control cholera by separating sewage from drinking water, the transition period was dangerous. Workers in the sewers were exposed to cholera bacteria constantly, and outbreaks among sewer workers were common in the early years of the system. The disease caused violent diarrhea and vomiting that could kill through dehydration within hours. And in the close quarters of sewer work gangs, one infected worker could quickly spread the disease to others. Typhoid fever was another constant threat, spread through contaminated water and food, particularly prevalent in the sewers where workers might eat their lunch with hands that, despite washing, retained traces of sewage. Typhoid caused high fever, weakness, abdominal pain, and in many cases, death or permanent organ damage. The disease could incubate for weeks, meaning a worker might not show symptoms until long after the exposure, making it difficult to trace where infection had occurred. Some sewer workers became chronic carriers of typhoid, like the famous Typhoid Mary, spreading disease to others even when they themselves showed no symptoms. These carriers might work in the sewers for years, unknowingly infecting colleagues, family members, and anyone else they came into contact with. Leptospirosis, or Weil's disease, as it was known in Victorian times after the doctor who described it, was perhaps the most characteristic disease of sewer workers. It was spread through the urine of infected rats, and given the rat population in the sewers and the constant exposure to water contaminated with rat urine, sewer workers had extremely high infection rates. The disease began with flu-like symptoms, but could progress to kidney failure, liver damage, and bleeding disorders that caused the characteristic yellowing of the skin and bleeding from mucous membranes. Before modern medical treatment, the mortality rate was high, and many sewer workers died from Weil's disease, often not understanding what had killed them or attributing their illness to sewer gas or bad air rather than to bacterial infection. Tetanus was common among sewer workers because of the combination of frequent cuts and scratches from sharp objects in the sewage and the presence of Clostridium tetani bacteria in soil and sewage. Tetanus causes painful muscle spasms and lockjaw, and before the development of antitoxin treatment in the 1890s, it was usually fatal. Workers who developed tetanus after injuries sustained in the sewers faced agonizing deaths, their bodies locked in rigid spasms, unable to eat or breathe properly, dying slowly over days or weeks. The fear of tetanus made even minor cuts serious concerns for sewer workers, though many injuries were simply unavoidable given the environment. Parasitic infections were endemic among sewer workers and anyone else who had regular contact with sewage. Intestinal worms of various types, including roundworms, tapeworms, and hookworms, were common and caused malnutrition, anemia, and chronic illness. some parasites could cause more serious complications. Liver flukes could damage the liver and bile ducts, and certain parasitic worms could migrate to other organs, causing abscesses or neurological problems. The constant cycle of infection and reinfection meant that many sewer workers carried parasite loads that significantly compromised their health, leaving them weak and susceptible to other diseases. The psychological toll of sewer work is harder to document, but was certainly significant. Men who worked in the sewers described feelings of claustrophobia and panic, particularly when working in narrow sections of tunnel or when floods threatened. The darkness was oppressive, even with lanterns. The pools of light only emphasized the vast darkness beyond, and shadows moved constantly, creating the impression of things lurking just outside the light. The sounds of the sewers were disturbing. The rushing of water, the echoes of dripping and flowing, the squeaking of rats, occasional grinding or cracking sounds from the structure itself, and sometimes inexplicable sounds that workers couldn't identify. Thuds or scrapes, or what sounded like voices in distant tunnels. Workers reported seeing things in the sewers, shapes in the darkness that might be rats or might be something else, movements in peripheral vision that disappeared when looked at directly, even full apparitions that appeared briefly and then vanished. These sightings were probably products of exhaustion, poor light, toxic gas exposure, and the power of suggestion in an environment that was genuinely frightening. But to the workers who experienced them, these visions were real and terrifying. Stories circulated of ghost workers, men who had died in the sewers and whose spirits remained there, of spectral lights that led workers astray into dangerous areas, of sounds of crying or screaming with no apparent source. Whether these phenomena had natural explanations or were hallucinations, they contributed to the sense that the sewers were haunted, that the underground was a place where the normal rules didn't apply. The criminal underworld made extensive use of the sewers for various purposes. Thieves used the sewers as escape routes, entering through one access point after a crime and emerging far from the scene before police could establish a perimeter. The maze of tunnels provided perfect cover, and knowledge of the sewer layout was valuable criminal intelligence. Some criminal gangs established hideouts in abandoned sections of the old sewers, spaces that were no longer part of the active system, but that remained accessible. These hideouts could store stolen goods, serve as meeting places, or provide temporary shelter when avoiding police searches above ground. The police were generally reluctant to pursue criminals into the sewers, both because of the dangers and because navigating the tunnels without expert knowledge was difficult and risky. Bodies were sometimes disposed of in the sewers, either murder victims whose killers wanted to hide evidence or bodies of people who had died of natural causes, but whose families couldn't afford burial and chose to dispose of the corpse secretly rather than face pauper burial. The sewage flow would gradually break down bodies, and what remained would be carried to the outfall points in the Thames, or would lodge in pipes and accumulate with other debris. When blockages were cleared, workers sometimes found human remains mixed with the other material, bones, decomposed tissue. Occasionally more intact bodies in areas where flow was slower. The discovery of human remains in the sewers was disturbing, but not uncommon, and it raised difficult questions about how the person had ended up there. Was it murder, suicide, accidental death, or intentional disposal of an already dead body? In many cases, the answer was never determined, and the remains were simply removed and buried without identification. The connections between sewers and other underground spaces created a hidden network beneath London. The sewers intersected with underground rivers, many of which had been built over as London expanded, but which still flowed in culverts beneath streets. The Fleet, the Westbourne, the Tyburn, the Walbrook. These and other rivers had been incorporated into the sewer system or ran parallel to it, and in some places it was possible to move from sewer tunnels into river culverts, and from there, potentially, into other underground spaces. Basements, vaults, crypts, forgotten cellars. Some of these connected to the sewers through old drains or through accidental breaches in walls. This created possibilities for movement through the underground that went beyond the official sewer routes. Smugglers and black marketeers potentially used these connections to move goods beneath the city without passing through customs or checkpoints. There are accounts, some verified and some possibly apocryphal, of goods being moved from ships at the docks through sewer tunnels to emerge in warehouses or shops far from the waterfront, avoiding taxes and inspection. The practicality of this is questionable. Moving goods through sewage would damage many products, and the difficulty and danger of sewer navigation might not be worth the avoided taxes. But for valuable, durable goods that could be cleaned, gold, jewels, certain manufactured items, the sewer smuggling route might have been viable. The secrecy surrounding such operations means we'll never know the full extent of how the sewers were used for illicit commerce. The fauna of the sewers extended beyond rats, pigs, and dogs to include various insects and other invertebrates that had adapted to the underground environment. Cockroaches thrived in enormous numbers, feeding on organic matter in the sewage and finding shelter in cracks and crevices in the tunnel walls. These weren't the small household cockroaches of today, but rather large species that could be several inches long. And in the darkness of the sewers, with only lantern light, they created disturbing scenes when disturbed. Masses of insects scattering across walls and floors. Spiders also inhabited the sewers, particularly in drier sections near ventilation shafts. Some quite large and unfamiliar to workers who encountered them, probably species that had found the sewers to be ideal habitat, and that weren't commonly seen above ground. Eels were common in the sewers, particularly in sections that connected to the Thames or to the underground rivers. Eels could grow to substantial size, several feet long and quite thick, and they were occasionally caught by sewer workers as a source of food, despite the questionable hygiene of eating animals that lived in sewage. The eels that lived permanently in the sewers developed distinctive pale coloration from lack of sunlight, and some reports describe blind eels that had adapted to the complete darkness of sections of tunnel that never saw daylight. Whether these eels were truly blind or had simply lost pigmentation is unclear, but their appearance was described as unsettling, ghostly white serpentine creatures moving through the black water. Fish occasionally made their way into the sewers from the Thames, particularly during high tides when water would back up into the outfall pipes. These fish would sometimes become trapped as the tide fell, unable to navigate back to the river, and they would swim through the sewer tunnels until they died or were eaten by rats or eels. The sight of fish swimming through sewage was surreal and disturbing to workers, a reminder of the connection between the enclosed world of the sewers and the river that was itself heavily polluted by sewage discharge. Some of these trapped fish survived for extended periods, adapting to feed on organic matter in the sewage, creating populations of fish living entirely within the sewer system. The ventilation shafts that connected the sewers to the surface world above were liminal spaces, tall vertical shafts with ladders that climbed from the tunnels up to street level, often 50 feet or more. These shafts were necessary for providing air circulation to prevent gas buildup, but they were also dangerous. Workers climbing the shafts, tired and carrying equipment, could fall, and falls from these heights were usually fatal. The shafts also created unusual acoustic effects. Sounds from the street above would echo down, distorted and strange, while sounds from the sewers would carry up, leading to reports of mysterious noises emerging from sewers, screams or groans, or other disturbing sounds that were actually just the amplified and distorted normal sounds of the underground, but which seemed supernatural when heard from above. Children occasionally fell through grates into the sewers, a tragedy that occurred with disturbing regularity in Victorian London. The street grates that provided drainage were sometimes in poor repair or had gaps wide enough for a small child to slip through. A child playing near a grate or trying to retrieve something that had fallen through could suddenly find themselves plunging into darkness and sewage. Some children who fell into the sewers were rescued quickly by passers-by or by sewer workers who happened to be nearby. But others were swept away by the current or fell into deep sections where they drowned before help could arrive, or were simply never found despite searches. The discovery of children's bodies during sewer maintenance was particularly distressing to workers, a reminder of the human cost of the inadequate infrastructure and the dangers of the underground. The treasures that toshers found in the sewers ranged from mundane to extraordinary. Coins were the most common find, dropped through street grates or washed from houses and businesses. Silver spoons, forks, and other cutlery were regularly discovered, probably lost down drains or tossed by careless servants. Jewelry was rarer, but more valuable: rings that had slipped off fingers while washing, necklaces that had broken and fallen, even occasionally pieces of significant value that had been lost by wealthy residents. Tools, particularly from shops and businesses that connected to the sewers, would make their way into the system. Bone and ivory items, buttons, buckles, all manner of small objects accumulated in the sludge. The most spectacular finds entered tosher folklore as legendary discoveries. Stories circulated of gold coins in bags, jewels in pouches, entire sets of silver plate supposedly discarded by panicked criminals. Some of these stories were probably true, while others were exaggerated or invented. But the possibility of finding something valuable kept toshers returning to the dangerous work. The hope that the next handful of sewage sifted might contain the treasure that would change their fortune. The reality was that most toshers earned barely enough to survive, finding enough small coins and scrap metal to feed themselves and perhaps their families. But the dream of the big find was what made the horror bearable. The smell of the sewers is difficult to convey to modern readers who haven't experienced anything comparable. It wasn't just the smell of human waste, though that was certainly a major component. It was a combination of decomposing organic matter, chemical effluent from factories, rotting food, decaying flesh, stagnant water, and various gases, including methane and hydrogen sulfide. The smell was thick, almost tangible, coating the throat and nasal passages, causing gagging and coughing in those not accustomed to it. Workers who entered the sewers regularly developed a degree of tolerance, their sense of smell adapting to filter out some of the worst elements, but they never became completely immune. And the smell clung to them, to their clothes, their hair, their skin, persisting for hours after they left the tunnels despite washing. Sewer workers were often identifiable by smell, marked by their occupation in a way they couldn't hide. The temperature in the sewers was relatively constant year-round, usually around 50-55 degrees Fahrenheit, cooler than summer temperatures above ground, but warmer than winter. This constant temperature created a stable environment for the organisms that lived there, but it also created challenges for workers. In summer, entering the cooler sewers from the heat above could be a relief initially, but the dampness made the coolness penetrating, and workers could become chilled despite the relatively moderate temperature. In winter, the sewers were warmer than the freezing streets, but the combination of dampness and cold still caused hypothermia in workers who spent extended time underground, particularly if their clothes became soaked with sewage. The acoustics of the sewers created a soundscape that was unique and unsettling. The brick tunnels echoed sounds in strange ways, making it difficult to judge distance or direction of sounds. A person walking through the sewers couldn't tell if sounds they heard were close by or coming from far away through miles of connecting tunnels. Voices would echo and distort, sometimes creating the impression of conversations in adjacent tunnels when the nearest other person was actually far away. The rushing of water created a constant background noise that masked other sounds, making it possible for someone or something to approach without being heard until they were very close. These acoustic properties meant that sewer workers developed a kind of hypervigilance, constantly listening for any sound that might indicate danger, whether from flooding, collapse, or other hazards. The navigation of the sewer system was a specialized skill that not everyone could master. The tunnels branched and intersected in complex patterns, and without maps or clear landmarks, it was easy to become disoriented. Sewer workers learned routes through repetition, and by developing a mental map of the system, they would note distinctive features, a particular brick pattern, a junction of a certain shape, the sound of water echoing from a specific direction, and use these as landmarks. But even experienced workers could become lost if they ventured into unfamiliar sections, or if flooding or darkness made their usual landmarks unrecognizable. Lost workers might wander for hours trying to find their way out, their lanterns gradually dimming as oil ran low, panic rising as they realized they didn't know which direction led to an exit. The maintenance of the system was constant and varied work. Blockages were common, caused by accumulation of solid matter, by objects large enough to obstruct pipes, or by fatbergs, solidified masses of fat and oil that had been poured down drains and that congealed in the tunnels. These blockages had to be cleared by hand, workers using shovels, picks, and their own strength to break apart the obstructions and restore flow. The work was exhausting and filthy, requiring hours of labor in cramped spaces filled with sewage. Some blockages were massive, taking crews days to clear, requiring them to return to the same spot shift after shift until the obstruction was finally removed and normal flow restored. The physical structure of the sewers revealed the layers of London's history, as older tunnels incorporated Roman, medieval, and early modern construction. Some sections showed Roman brickwork, nearly 2,000 years old, still sound and serving as part of the Victorian system. These ancient sections had different dimensions, different construction techniques, and they often led to spaces that weren't on any modern maps. Workers who discovered these old sections reported finding chambers that seemed to serve no clear purpose, possibly old cisterns or storage spaces from centuries past, now filled with sewage and debris, but still intact structurally. These spaces sometimes contained artifacts, fragments of pottery, old bottles, even occasionally coins or other objects from earlier eras. The River Fleet, one of London's underground rivers, deserves special attention because it remained one of the most significant features of the sewer system, despite being largely forgotten by surface dwellers. The Fleet had been a substantial river in medieval times, flowing from Hampstead Heath down to the Thames. But as London expanded, it became increasingly polluted and was gradually covered over, becoming part of the sewer system by the 19th century. The Fleet Sewer was one of the major channels, large enough in places for small boats to navigate, though doing so was incredibly dangerous and foul. The sewer followed the river's original course, and in some sections, particularly near the Thames, the flow was still substantial. A rushing torrent of sewage that could sweep a person off their feet and carry them downstream to drown or be crushed against obstructions. Reports from the 19th century describe unusual phenomena associated with the Fleet Sewer. The rushing water created strong currents and eddies that could trap debris, and even people in circular currents difficult to escape. The acoustics of this particular sewer were especially strange, with the rushing water creating sounds that workers interpreted as voices or music. Some claimed to hear the sound of singing or chanting echoing through the Fleet Sewer, probably just the water flowing over particular obstacles, creating harmonics. But to those who heard it in the dark, it sounded uncannily like human voices raised in song. These acoustic effects contributed to the folklore about the Fleet. Stories that it was haunted by the ghosts of people who had drowned in it centuries earlier when it flowed above ground. The tidal sections of the sewers, those nearest the Thames that were affected by the rising and falling of the river, created their own unique hazards. When the tide came in, water would back up into these sections, sometimes rising rapidly and flooding tunnels that had been walkable just hours before. Workers in tidal sections had to keep close track of tide schedules and be ready to evacuate quickly when the tide turned. The mixing of river water with sewage created particularly noxious conditions, and the churning of water as tide and sewage flow met could stir up deposits that had settled, filling the air with even more toxic gases and smells than usual. Some workers refused to enter tidal sections, considering them too dangerous, and those who did work there demanded higher pay. The interaction between the sewers and London's underground railway system, which began construction in the 1860s, created new complexities and dangers. The Metropolitan Railway and later tube lines were dug through soil that already contained sewer tunnels, and occasionally excavations would breach into sewers, flooding the railway works with sewage or creating openings between the two systems. These breaches had to be sealed quickly, but some connections persisted, and there were sections where sewer and railway tunnels ran parallel to each other, separated by only a wall of brick or earth. Workers in both systems were aware of each other's presence, sometimes hearing sounds from the adjacent tunnels, the flow of sewage from the railway side, the rumble of trains from the sewer side. The mythology that developed around the sewers transformed them in the Victorian imagination into a kind of underworld, separate from the city above and governed by different rules. Penny dreadful stories and sensational journalism featured the sewers as settings for Gothic horror and adventure. The sewers were portrayed as lairs of criminals, hiding places for monsters, passages to secret temples, or ancient ruins beneath London. While most of these stories were pure fiction, they reflected genuine anxiety and fascination with the underground spaces beneath the city. The sewers represented everything that Victorian society wanted to hide: waste, poverty, disease, crime, all pushed underground but not truly eliminated, always present beneath the respectable surface. The relationship between sewer workers and toshers was complex and sometimes hostile. Official workers saw toshers as interlopers who complicated their work and potentially endangered themselves through ignorance of the system's dangers. Toshers, meanwhile, saw official workers as obstacles to their livelihood and would go to great lengths to avoid encounters. When the two groups did meet in the tunnels, confrontations could occur. Official workers might try to drive toshers out or report their presence to authorities. Toshers might flee into dangerous sections of tunnel rather than risk arrest. But there were also instances of cooperation. Workers who turned a blind eye to toshers, or who even provided information about where valuables might have accumulated, perhaps in exchange for a share of fines. Some retired or off-duty sewer workers supplemented their income through toshing, using their expert knowledge of the system for personal profit. The equipment used by sewer workers evolved over the Victorian period, but remained relatively simple. Heavy boots with hobnails for grip on slippery surfaces were essential. Long coats made of waxed canvas or oilcloth provided some protection from sewage splashes, though nothing could keep workers truly dry. Lanterns were the most critical tool, usually oil lanterns that could provide several hours of light, though they required constant attention to maintain the flame and to adjust for air quality. Later in the period, some workers used more advanced lamps with better ventilation and safety features. But light sources remained vulnerable to water, gas, and the generally harsh conditions. Shovels, rakes, and long poles for probing and clearing blockages completed the basic toolkit. The development of specialized equipment for particularly difficult conditions showed the creativity and adaptability of sewer workers. For working in very deep sewage, workers developed waders and even primitive diving equipment, though the latter was rarely used due to the difficulty of breathing apparatus functioning in such foul conditions. For clearing blockages in pipes too small for humans to enter, systems of rods and scrapers were developed that could be pushed through from access points. For detecting gas, workers learned to observe candle flames and to pay attention to how they felt. Headaches, dizziness, and nausea were early warnings of gas exposure that meant immediate evacuation. The social status of sewer workers was complicated. They were necessary for the functioning of the city, and they did dangerous work that few others were willing to do, which might have earned them respect. But they worked with sewage, and the stigma attached to this was powerful in Victorian society, where cleanliness was associated with morality. Sewer workers were often avoided socially, excluded from pubs and other public spaces because of their smell and their occupation. They formed their own community drinking in their own establishments, living in their own neighborhoods, marrying within their own group. This created a hereditary class of sewer workers, sons following fathers into the trade, families specializing in this work across generations. The insularity of this community reinforced both their expertise and their marginalization. The pay for sewer work was better than many unskilled laboring jobs, reflecting the danger and unpleasantness. But it wasn't enough to lift workers into middle-class respectability. A sewer worker might earn enough to rent decent housing and feed his family adequately, but he remained working class, and the nature of his work marked him as lower working class, despite the relative security of his employment. The combination of steady work and social stigma created a strange position, economically stable but socially marginal, necessary but reviled, known to everyone but avoided by most. The first-person accounts from sewer workers that survive provide vivid insights into their experiences. These accounts, published in newspapers, social reform publications, or collected by Victorian journalists interested in documenting the lives of London's working poor, describe the realities of the work in ways that statistics cannot. Workers describe the moment of descent into the sewers, climbing down a ladder from the bright daylight into increasing darkness, until reaching the bottom where only their lantern provides light. They describe the adjustment period as eyes and nose adapt to the new environment. The initial overwhelming smell giving way to a dull, constant presence, the darkness becoming familiar rather than terrifying. They describe the routine of the work, the systematic inspection and clearing of assigned sections, the careful attention to signs of danger, the constant vigilance that keeps them alive. But these accounts also describe moments of beauty or strangeness that broke the routine. The patterns of light reflecting off water, creating glittering, shifting designs on tunnel walls. The fossilized shells occasionally visible in ancient brickwork, reminders that London was built on land that had once been underwater. The moments of camaraderie among work gangs, jokes and stories shared during rest breaks, the bonds formed through shared danger. These accounts humanize the sewer workers, showing them not as unfortunates to be pitied, but as skilled workers who took pride in their competence, who found meaning in their work despite its difficulties, who formed communities and relationships like workers in any trade. The impact of sewer work on family life was significant. Workers would return home exhausted, reeking despite washing, sometimes traumatized by what they had seen or experienced underground. Wives and children of sewer workers dealt with the anxiety of not knowing if their husband or father would return safely, as deaths and serious injuries were common. The smell that clung to workers affected their home environment. Neighbors could identify a sewer worker's house by the smell, another form of stigma that marked the entire family. Children of sewer workers might be teased or excluded at school, marked by their father's occupation. Yet families also took pride in the work, understanding its importance and difficulty, supporting each other through the challenges it created. The seasonal variations in sewer conditions created different challenges throughout the year. Summer brought heat that intensified smells and increased gas production as organic matter decomposed faster in warmer temperatures. The higher temperatures also meant more insects and faster breeding of rats. Winter brought cold that, while it reduced smells somewhat, created risks of hypothermia for workers whose clothes became wet. Winter also meant longer hours of darkness above ground, which mattered less in the sewers themselves, but affected workers' daily routines of traveling to and from work sites. Spring brought heavy rains that increased flooding risks, making many sections of sewer too dangerous to enter. Autumn brought falling leaves and other organic debris that could create blockages, requiring extensive clearing work. The specialized knowledge that sewer workers accumulated about London's underground geography was valuable in unexpected ways. During wartime or civil unrest, authorities sometimes consulted sewer workers about underground routes that might be used for troop movements or evacuations. During criminal investigations, sewer workers might be asked about possible escape routes criminals could have taken. And for archaeological or historical research, sewer workers could provide information about old structures they had encountered, Roman walls, or medieval foundations incorporated into the sewer system. This knowledge wasn't written down in most cases, but existed as practical expertise passed from experienced workers to novices through years of working together in the tunnels. The effect of electric lighting, when it was eventually introduced to some sections of the sewers, was transformative. The steady, bright light of electric bulbs revealed the sewers in detail that had never been visible by lantern light. Workers could see further, could spot hazards more easily, could navigate more confidently. But electric light also revealed the full extent of the filth and horror. What lantern light had left mercifully in shadow was now fully visible. Some workers found the electric light disturbing for this reason, preferring the limited visibility of lanterns that allowed imagination to fill in the darkness, rather than seeing everything in stark detail. And electric light didn't reach most of the system. Vast areas remained lit only by portable lanterns, as installing and maintaining electrical infrastructure throughout the sewers was prohibitively expensive. The connections between sewers and plague are worth examining, though the science wasn't understood during the Victorian period. Plague, the Black Death that had devastated London in earlier centuries, was transmitted by fleas that lived on rats, and the massive rat population in the sewers was potential reservoir for plague bacteria. Victorian doctors, not understanding the flea transmission, couldn't explain why plague seemed to have declined, even as rat populations remained high. The answer was that the specific species of flea most likely to transmit plague to humans was less common in London by the Victorian period, and housing had improved enough that rats and humans didn't share living space as closely as in medieval times. But the fear that plague might emerge from the sewers persisted, and outbreaks of other diseases were sometimes mistaken for plague, causing panic that the sewers were breeding pestilence. The actual breeding of pestilence, in the form of disease-carrying mosquitoes and other insects, was real, if not quite as dramatic as plague. Stagnant water in some sewer sections provided breeding grounds for mosquitoes, which would then emerge through street grates and ventilation shafts to bite people above ground. These mosquitoes could potentially carry diseases, though the tropical diseases that mosquitoes are most associated with today weren't major threats in London's climate, but other insect-borne illnesses existed, and the sewer's role as breeding ground for disease vectors was recognized, if not fully understood scientifically. Efforts to improve sewer ventilation and drainage were partly motivated by the desire to reduce these breeding grounds. The philosophy of out of sight, out of mind that governed Victorian attitudes toward sewage had broader implications for how society dealt with unpleasant realities. The sewers were a physical manifestation of the desire to hide away problems rather than solve them at source. The sewage was generated by every household and business in London, but once it disappeared down drains, it became someone else's problem, the problem of sewer workers and of the Thames estuary communities where the sewage was discharged. This same attitude applied to other social problems: poverty, crime, disease, prostitution. All were to be hidden away in institutions or marginalized neighborhoods rather than addressed through systemic change. The sewers thus served as both practical infrastructure and as metaphor for Victorian social policy, burying problems underground where respectable society didn't have to look at them. The question of what truly lurked in Victorian sewers at night becomes both more mundane and more disturbing when we understand that the real horrors weren't supernatural, but human and biological. The worst things in those tunnels were the conditions that humans had created, the diseases that thrived there, the social inequalities that forced some people to work or scavenge in sewage, and the indifference of a society that allowed all of this to continue because it was hidden underground. But there's also something to be said for the genuine mystery that surrounded the sewers. The fact that miles and miles of tunnel existed in near total darkness, that entire sections were rarely or never visited, and that in such an environment, strange things could exist unnoticed. The urban legends that emerged from the sewers had kernels of truth that made them more powerful than pure fiction. Stories of giant rats weren't entirely wrong. Rats in sewers did grow larger than their street-dwelling cousins due to better food supply, even if they weren't quite the monstrous sizes some stories claimed. Tales of people living in the sewers were absolutely true, though the reality of homeless people sheltering in sewage tunnels was more tragic than terrifying. Stories of treasures in the sewers were based on the real finds that toshers made, though the legendary hoards were exaggerated. and stories of ghost lights and strange sounds had natural explanations in bioluminescent bacteria and acoustic effects. But the experiences that inspired the stories were genuine. The legacy of Victorian sewers extends into the present day, as much of Bazalgette's system remains in use. The brick tunnels built in the 1860s still carry London's sewage, supplemented by more modern additions, but fundamentally unchanged in many sections. This means that the same tunnels where Victorian sewer workers labored, where toshers searched for treasures, where rats and pigs lived, where homeless people sheltered, these tunnels are still there, still dark, still damp, still carrying waste beneath the modern city. Modern sewer workers inherit the knowledge and traditions of their Victorian predecessors, though they have better equipment, better safety procedures, and better understanding of the health hazards they face. The Victorian sewers changed London in profound ways that went beyond the obvious public health improvements. They changed how people thought about urban infrastructure, demonstrating that large-scale engineering projects could solve problems that had seemed intractable. They changed the geography of disease, redirecting sewage away from the city center and dramatically reducing death rates from cholera and typhoid. Though this simply moved the problem downstream to the Thames estuary, where poor communities continued to suffer from contaminated water. They changed labor patterns, creating a class of specialized workers and an underground economy of scavenging. And they changed the city's relationship with its own waste, making it invisible to most residents who could now flush away their sewage without thinking about where it went or who dealt with it. The environmental impact of the Victorian sewer system was enormous and not entirely positive despite the public health benefits. Concentrating all of London's sewage and discharging it into the Thames meant that the river, which had been polluted before, became catastrophically contaminated. Fish died in massive numbers. The water became anoxic in places, unable to support life. The smell from the river, especially in summer, was overwhelming for miles downstream from the outfall points. Communities along the Thames suffered from waterborne diseases, even as central London's health improved. It would take decades and additional infrastructure, sewage treatment plants, rather than just collection and discharge, before the Thames began to recover. The Victorian solution had simply moved the problem rather than truly solving it. But for those living in central London, that was sufficient. The psychological impact of knowing that beneath your feet, beneath the streets you walked every day, there existed this vast network of tunnels filled with sewage and darkness, and all manner of strange life, was significant in shaping Victorian urban consciousness. The sewers became a symbol of hidden depths, of secrets buried beneath respectable surfaces, of the price of civilization and progress. Writers from Charles Dickens to Arthur Conan Doyle incorporated sewers into their works as settings for mystery, danger, and social commentary. The sewers represented the underside of Victorian society in literal and metaphorical ways, a reminder that progress and prosperity were built on foundations that were dark, foul, and dangerous for those who had to work in or navigate them. The heroism of sewer workers, though rarely acknowledged in their own time, deserves recognition. These men descended daily into environments that would terrify most people, faced dangers from gas, flooding, collapse, disease, and a dozen other hazards, and did essential work that kept the city functioning. They saved lives through their labor, preventing the disease outbreaks that would have occurred if the sewers weren't maintained. They rescued people who fell or got lost in the tunnels. They explored and mapped sections of the underground that no one else would venture into. And they did all of this for modest pay and little respect, marked by their occupation as lesser members of society, despite the importance and difficulty of their work. The fact that so many of them continued the work year after year, even after witnessing colleagues die or become seriously injured, speaks to a kind of courage and dedication that deserves recognition. The women connected to sewer work, wives and daughters of workers, also deserve mention. They dealt with the smell that permeated their homes, the anxiety of wondering if their men would return safely, the social stigma of being associated with sewage work. Some women worked in related trades, laundresses who cleaned the heavy work clothes despite the filth and smell, or seamstresses who repaired clothing damaged in the tunnels. Others managed households on the irregular income that could result when illness or injury prevented their husbands from working. These women were essential support for the sewer workers, but were even more invisible in historical records than the workers themselves. Their contributions taken for granted and rarely documented. The transition from Victorian sewer systems to modern sanitation represents one of the great public health achievements in history, and understanding what the Victorian sewers were like helps us appreciate this progress. Modern sewer systems have better ventilation, reducing gas hazards. They have better access points and safety equipment, reducing risks of drowning and collapse. They have monitoring systems that can detect problems before they become critical. Workers have protective equipment, respirators, waterproof suits, modern lighting. The work is still unpleasant and dangerous, but it's far less deadly than it was in Victorian times. And modern understanding of disease transmission means workers can be vaccinated or treated for the illnesses they're exposed to, drastically reducing mortality from disease. The sewers also serve as archaeological sites, preserving artifacts and information about Victorian London that exists nowhere else. Items lost or discarded in the Victorian period remain in the sewers, sometimes preserved by the anaerobic conditions in sewage. Coins, bottles, tools, clothing fragments, all provide physical evidence of daily life in ways that complement written records. The structure of the sewers themselves tells stories about construction techniques, urban planning, and the priorities and assumptions of Victorian engineers. modern archaeologists and historians have begun to recognize sewers as valuable historical resources, though accessing them for research purposes is difficult given the obvious challenges and the fact that they remain active infrastructure. The relationship between sewers and class in Victorian society was stark and unchanging. The wealthy benefited from sewers without having to think about them or interact with them directly. Their waste disappeared down pipes and became someone else's problem. The middle classes were aware of sewers as important infrastructure, but maintained social distance from anything connected to them, and the working class, particularly the sewer workers and those desperate enough to scavenge in the tunnels, bore the direct costs in terms of health, danger, and social stigma. This pattern of environmental burden falling on those least able to refuse or escape it was characteristic of Victorian industrialization more broadly, but it was particularly visible in the literal division between the clean surface world and the filthy underground. The future of London's sewers, even in the Victorian period, was a subject of concern and debate. Engineers recognized that the system built by Bazalgette, as impressive as it was, would eventually be overwhelmed by continued population growth. Proposals for expansion and improvement were constantly under discussion, though implementation was slow due to cost and the difficulty of working on infrastructure that couldn't be shut down for major renovations. The Victorian engineers who thought about the long term worried about what would happen in the 20th century and beyond, whether their sewers would still be adequate, whether future generations would maintain and expand the system, or whether neglect would lead to failure and a return to the disease-ridden conditions that had preceded the great sewer construction. These worries were justified as modern London continues to struggle with sewage infrastructure that was largely designed in the 19th century and that barely copes with 21st century demands. The mythology of alligators in sewers, while primarily an American urban legend rather than a British one, does have Victorian precursors in stories about what might be living in London's tunnels. Stories circulated of exotic animals that had escaped from ships or collections and had found their way into the sewers where they survived by eating rats. Monkeys, large snakes, even big cats were occasionally rumored to be living underground. These stories were almost certainly false, or at most based on brief, genuine sightings of escaped animals that quickly died in the hostile environment. But they speak to the sense that the sewers were a separate world where normal rules might not apply, where anything might be living in the darkness. The spiritual and religious dimensions of sewer work are rarely discussed, but were real for many workers. Some saw their work as a form of penance or testing, enduring the underground as a way to earn salvation or prove their faith. Others found that the regular confrontation with filth and death and danger caused them to lose faith, unable to reconcile the suffering they witnessed and experienced with belief in a benevolent God. Some workers developed superstitions specific to sewer work, rituals or prayers they would perform before descending, lucky charms they carried, beliefs about which tunnels were cursed, or which times of day were more dangerous. The sewers were liminal spaces between the world above and some imagined deeper underground, and workers who spent significant time there developed complex relationships with these spaces that combined practical knowledge with spiritual or superstitious beliefs. As you drift towards sleep tonight, think about what truly lurked in those Victorian sewers, not monsters or supernatural beings, but human desperation, human ingenuity, human endurance, and human inequality. Think about the sewer workers who descended into darkness and filth every day to keep the city functioning, who faced dangers that would terrify most of us, and who did so for modest pay and little respect. Think about the toshers, so poor that searching through sewage for pennies seemed like a reasonable way to feed their families, so desperate that they risked death for the chance of finding something valuable. Think about the homeless people who sheltered in sewage tunnels because they had nowhere else to go, choosing the horror of the sewers over the alternatives available to them on the streets. Think too about the engineering achievement that the sewers represented, the vision to conceive of such a massive project, the skill to design and build it, the labor of thousands of workers who excavated millions of tons of earth and laid millions of bricks to create the tunnels. The Victorian sewers were a triumph of human capability and determination, proof that seemingly insurmountable problems could be solved through collective effort and technical expertise. They saved countless lives by preventing disease outbreaks. They made modern urban life possible by providing a way to manage waste from millions of people. And they demonstrated that cities could be transformed through infrastructure investment. But remember also the costs and inequalities built into this achievement. The workers who built the sewers labored in dangerous conditions for low pay. The communities downstream from the sewage outfalls suffered from contaminated water so that central London could be clean. The social problems of poverty and desperation weren't solved, but only hidden underground, pushed into tunnels where respectable society didn't have to see them. The sewers were a solution to specific problems of sanitation and disease. But they were also a symbol of Victorian society's tendency to hide away uncomfortable realities rather than address root causes. The sewers remind us that cities are built on hidden infrastructures and hidden labor, that the comfortable lives of the prosperous depend on work done by others in places most will never see. The darkness beneath Victorian London was filled with real horrors, disease, danger, suffering, inequality, but also with real heroism, dedication, skill, endurance, and the stubborn human capacity to survive and even find meaning in the worst conditions. The stories from the sewers, both the documented facts and the legends that grew around them, tell us truths about human nature and social organization that remain relevant today. So rest now in the knowledge that the Victorian sewers are still there, beneath modern London, still dark and damp, and carrying waste, still occasionally explored by workers who descend into them, continuing a tradition that stretches back over a century and a half. The rats are still there, smaller populations now, but still present. The tunnels still echo with strange sounds. The structure still occasionally fails, requiring repair work that's not so different from what Victorian workers did. The sewers persist as monuments to Victorian engineering, but also as reminders of Victorian inequality, of the suffering that was accepted as necessary for progress, of the human costs of urbanization and industrialization. The real horror of the Victorian sewers wasn't supernatural. It was mundane, the daily reality of disease and danger and indignity that was normal for those who worked or existed in those spaces. The real mystery wasn't about monsters lurking in the darkness, but about how societies organize themselves, who benefits and who suffers, who is remembered and who is forgotten, what we choose to hide and what we choose to acknowledge. These are questions that the sewers raised then, and that they continue to raise now, as we build and maintain the infrastructures that allow modern life, while often ignoring or marginalizing those who do the difficult, dangerous, essential work that keeps those systems functioning. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere beneath cities around the world, there are tunnels carrying waste. There are workers maintaining systems that most of us never think about. There is darkness and danger that persists because it's necessary for the light and comfort above. The Victorian sewers were one manifestation of this reality, perhaps the first on such a massive scale, certainly one of the most thoroughly documented. The stories from those sewers, disturbing and tragic, and occasionally darkly fascinating, are stories we should remember, not as entertainment, but as history that teaches us about who we were and who we continue to be, about progress and its costs, about civilization and its foundations. The sewers are beneath us, literally and metaphorically, foundations that we build upon but rarely examine, darkness that supports the light. Remember them. Remember the people who worked there, and recognize that their struggle continues in different forms, in different places, wherever the hidden infrastructures of modern life require someone to descend into darkness so that others can live in light. Good night.